As you can see, today I'm going to try to mimic a classroom in my little office here. I'm going to be writing things over on this virtual board over here, and so this way I get to stand. Also, you'll notice, I apologize, but the beard comes off every year at this time, right? So I lost my friendly beard. What does that mean? I'm probably not as good of a thinker. I am probably less of a radical leftist all of a sudden. I lost some of my credibility. Good? Ooh, I'm suddenly getting conservative. I'm suddenly thinking people don't deserve things. Just kidding. All right. So what we're doing today is something that I wish a teacher had done for me when I was in college. As you're going through your life, you hear people I can't talk. What I'm doing here today is something that I wish a teacher had done for me. As I was walking through my young life, like you are, I would hear people talk about words like socialism and liberal and conservative and fascist, and everyone just expected that I knew what these words mean. Well, as I got older and devoted a good part of my life to studying political theory and these sorts of things, I found that a lot of these people using these words don't understand them themselves. Let's be more fair, right? In the very basic sense, you could say that, let's say a liberal knows what a liberal believes. I don't think they could define it, though. When a conservative makes fun of a liberal, do you think they actually know what the liberal thinks and wants? When a liberal makes fun of a conservative, do you think they could explain what a conservative is in a way that a conservative would agree to? No. So this is what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to lay out the whole political spectrum, from the far right to the far left, and I'm going to try to come up with definitions that, now some of you will hold some of these ideologies. I hope I do such a good job that you would find this enlightening even for your own perspective, to where, if I do a perfect job, you would say, I absolutely agree with what he just said about my view. Others of you, of course, will really like this because you'll get to hear what your view actually is. You don't know what to call yourself, and now I think you'll like this. All right, so let me say a few things about how I will frame this political spectrum. First, because I can't walk very far on my little board here, I don't have a full long board that I can map the political spectrum on. What I will do, so that you have a visual metaphor, is I will pretend that I'm laying things out on an ordinary ruler. So this way I can tell you, okay, the middle is at a 6, right? The extreme right, what is it? Is way there, over there by 12 or 11. The extreme left, I can tell you, are we all the way to the most radical 1 on our ruler spectrum? So that will be my metaphor. Now notice, of course, where the middle is will differ by what country you're in, and also what part of history you're in. For example, right now in this country, the middle is now, like it is almost in the middle in the globe, still nudged a little right. But when you guys were little kids, we were nudged fairly far right. We had gotten rid of a lot of the sorts of ideas that most countries have, especially rich democracies. Good? The other point of framing is to say something about history. Now, I think it is a little unclear to label this as just here is the left, here is the right. Because I think what often happens in history is you get kind of a spiraling. That throughout history, countries have tended to move farther and farther left, be more and more democratic, have more and more control of their resources, right? Individuals have more rights and freedoms. But what typically happens in history? One story you'll hear is that as you get farther towards socialism, it just doesn't work and the thing implodes on itself. Well, I think just as often what you find is as countries become more socialist, as they start to have more control of their resources, want to do what's best for their citizens and not serve established powers like their colonizing country, right? They don't want to support sending their resources to, cough, cough, the United States or Russia. What happens? In order to defend themselves against these powerful conservative economies, they have to become almost fascist and conservative themselves. In order to defend themselves, what do they have to do? Spend a lot of money on their military, have a strong central government that can organize all this production and resources. And so what do they become? More conservative, more fascist themselves. So you see this in most countries throughout history, moving farther left, having to defend themselves against the more conservative, more powerful countries, and so they become like the countries that they hate and that they're fighting against. Also note that I will not be doing the traditional textbook political spectrum. I am not going to be basing what countries are called based on what they call themselves, or just what the leader's title is. So for example, you'll hear some of the stupidest textbook entries about, look at Nazi Germany, it is socialism. No, it's fascism, right? Just because it calls itself National Socialism doesn't make it socialist. Or take another example. You will often hear textbooks spending a lot of time on what are called monarchies. I think they like this word because it's easy to define. But notice, if you define a country by if the leader is royal, right, or you have a king or a queen in charge, well then you lose track of what it's like to actually live in these societies. For example, by definition, let's go to, let's think. Well, by definition, historically, you could say that Britain is a monarchy, you could say that Denmark is a monarchy, you could say that Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. Well, take those last two. If we're comparing Denmark to Saudi Arabia, and you're saying, look, these are both monarchies, you're completely losing track of what it's like to actually be a citizen in these societies. Saudi Arabia is one of the most conservative, even reactionary countries on the planet, and Denmark is one of the most liberal, one of the most equal societies with the most care and social programs you could find. Saudi Arabia, women only got permission to drive fairly recently. That was illegal. It's one of the most unequal and unfree societies on the planet. Denmark is one of the most equal and free societies on the planet. Do you want pot? Totally fine in Denmark. Very little restriction on that. So, the way I will be organizing my political spectrum is in, I think, on what gets at what it's like to actually be a citizen of these countries. You don't care what your leader calls himself. What you care about mostly is how things are produced and how things are distributed. Who owns what, who gets what job, and who gets the products and services from the government, from these companies, from the individuals. So we're going to look at production and distribution and how property is handled as the key distinctions, because I think these reveal what it would be like to be an ordinary person living in these societies. This production distribution idea will be easy if we start at the very extreme right. At the extreme right, we can call it all sorts of things. You could call it tyranny, you could call it authoritarianism, but here it's easy. Because how are production and distribution organized? Easy. Production is completely at the discretion of the leaders, of the authority, of the tyrannical leader, and distribution is however he or she sees fit, usually for their own benefit. So what it's like in these societies, obviously the individual just hopes to get lucky and be favored by those in power because they will get the goods and services. All right, DC, that's easy. Oh, lastly, we should mention property. Property is owned completely by the authority, by whoever is in charge of the economy and the government. Easy example. Let's go to, say, 910 on our political spectrum of our ruler. Far to the right is one of my favorite words. Now, the only problem with me explaining what this is that I'm going to ruin the word for you. What is the word? Fascist, or fascism. That is so fun to say. Now, the problem is, I'm so sorry, is I'm going to tell you what this word actually means, and that's going to ruin it for you because you can't use it haphazardly. So, let's get it out of our system. Let's use the word one more time freely before I ruin it by showing you what it actually means, and so now you'll have to think about when you use it. All right, so just because I feel bad, what we are all going to do is on the count of 3, we are going to shout at our little screen, our phone, our computer, whatever you're watching, and you're going to stare right into my little beady eyes, and you are going to say, Jeff, you're a fascist. Okay? On the count of 3, we're all going to say that to me because I'm going to take this word back. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Jeff, you're a fascist. Okay, good. Love that word. But here's the problem. That is not what the word means. In fact, to be careful, I am the least fascist probably of anyone in my class and anyone watching this video. Fascism is not the same thing as socialist or anything like this. So here's what fascism means. A fascist country is a country preparing or at war. You are not fascist unless, and let's go through production and distribution. Fascism means that production is organized by an agreement between three groups: the military, corporations, and the state or the government. And how is production organized? How they want for the needs of war. And so this tells us how goods and services are distributed. They're distributed to meet the needs of war. Now, let's say something about this. What does this often result in? A real reduction in democracy, a real reduction in rights and freedoms, because, war is hard to wage on a national scale. So you need to remake your economy, remake your rights, even your court systems, even your freedoms, to meet the demands of war. What does this mean? This means that any country, no matter how free, democratic, and equal you are, that when you're at war, you become at least moderately fascist, because you have to change your economy and laws to meet these dire needs of war. Did Lincoln forego some of our rights, like our rights to a free trial, a trial of our peers, habeas corpus it's called? Did he restrict some of these rights because of the Civil War? Sure, right? Did Roosevelt restrict some of our basic rights and radically change our economy due to World War II? Of course. A country at war becomes at least a little bit, or I think most of the time, moderately fascist because of the demands of war. Now I'm going to get weird, right? Now I'm going to get controversial. But I don't think it's controversial. If it is a truism, and I think it is, that a country at war will become at least moderately fascist, then we can ask this really fun chicken and the egg question. Let me frame this with a prefatory question. How often is the United States at war, especially in the last 90 years? Answer, all the time. We are always either at war or in a conflict, or, if you don't know your history, overthrowing some country, sending troops there in some way, whether the American public knows about it or not. But anyway, even the wars we know about, they seem to be continual. We seem to have always had some kind of war going on. Right now we have 2.5 wars, maybe put them all together, we have 3 wars right now. Pretty typical. Here's the chicken and the egg question. Is the U.S. a little bit fascist or moderately fascist because we're at war? Or are we at war because we like to be moderately fascist? Frame that a different way. Do our leaders keep a fairly fascist economy because we happen to be at war? Or do our leaders love a fascist economy and so make sure to keep us at war? For instance, the Cold War, what did we do? There really wasn't a war going on, except secret ones in South America and Africa that most people don't know about. During the Cold War, what happened? We maintained a fascist economy by making people think we were still at war, even though we weren't directly declaring war with anyone. Interesting. All right, so let's take another jump farther left. Let's talk about what in the United States is called libertarianism. If you didn't hear me say it before, we were talking about Narveson, please note that if you're in other parts of the world, libertarianism is a far left phenomenon. If you say you're libertarian in Europe or South America or East Asia, people will ask you what kind of a socialist you are. Whereas in America, if you say you're libertarian, you're up here like a 7 or an 8, pretty far right in our political spectrum. Good? So, libertarianism, we studied Narveson, so we saw the moral sort of idea, and a little bit, if you paid attention to that, of the economic idea. So, we don't have to spend too much time here. The basic idea of the libertarian is a pure sort of capitalism. A capitalism with very limited taxation, right? So what do people do with their resources? They do whatever they want with their resources. They have very little collective control of property or rights or welfare programs. So what it is a more individualistic sense of rights. What do you want? A very limited role of government. You want capitalism to provide both the production and the distribution, and government should stay out of the way. For the individual, what does it mean? You are on your own. The basic calling card is leave me alone. I can take care of myself. Now, even worse, hospitals. Under a pure libertarian model, what do you say about hospitals? You should not collect tax dollars from me. I shouldn't have to pay for the health care of anyone else. If I need health care, I'll pay for it myself. Damn. Can you always save up enough money to pay for all the equipment and services you need? No, you would have to be extremely wealthy. What if I need a blood transfusion? How expensive is this going to be? I need an MRI? Oh my gosh, that is going to cost you a fortune unless you're going to buy your own MRI machine, and you would have to be a multimillionaire to have that laying around. All right, so take our next step. Now we are, if we're looking at our ruler, between 6 and 7. And so this is where the United States typically is. We are called a democratic republic. Now, Americans are really afraid of their government. They always are, so they always laugh when you make fun of it. So I will make fun of a democratic republic style of governing. Now, what does this mean? This means you don't have pure democracy. People don't vote on the economy. People don't vote for health care. They vote for representatives who they hope will give them what they want. What do they vote for when it comes to distribution? They vote for more access to resources, more access to health care, more access to good schools. Well, in a system like ours, what do the representatives do? Well, they give speeches saying that they're going to cater to the things people need, and then when it comes to actually passing laws, what do? They tend to cater to people who will get them reelected. We have a very profit-driven sort of electoral system. How often do politicians campaign in this country? All the time. Do you realize that that's not the norm in other countries? That you are limited for how long you can campaign? Do you notice how easily we could do this? We could easily pass a law that says you can spend no time campaigning until, 7 weeks, 8 weeks before the election. If you spend any money on your campaign, it's illegal except for 6 weeks before the election. Do you realize how much money that would save? Anyway, so what do they actually do? Who pays for their campaigns? Is it very common, almost, 99% of the time, the person with the most money will be elected? Well, where do they get money? Corporations, and so what do? Instead of voting for fairer distributions and passing those laws, they pass laws that favor their biggest donors, which are corporations. And what do corporations like? They like things like war and things like this. So if you cater to corporations, cater toward the military, you're more likely to be reelected. Quick tangent. What's the easiest solution here? Publicly financed elections. Sorry, right? Now think of this. Instead of having any campaigning, now notice, throughout our history, people have tried to limit campaign contributions. But what happened? We have a weird country with weird laws. Some lawyers went to the Supreme Court and said, by the way, money should count as speech, and corporations are people. So, if you tell a corporation they can't spend as much as they want on some bill or some candidate, you are limiting a person's free speech. Yes, it's insane, right? So what do we have to do? We can't do half measures. We have to go fully public financed elections. What does this mean? There will be no campaign financing. This will be a public enterprise. That means the resources will be very limited. But can the candidates have access to the public? Of course. Television is a public enterprise, right? You can easily just flat out tell the TV stations and the websites that you have to put this on, right? This is the debate, and you can give each candidate so much airtime. Great, easy, right? They can't spend any of their own money. They just have to use the public resources available. All right, so far, so now we're getting closer to the middle. And let me just say, We are, at the end, going to spend more time right in that middle barrier, the kinds of conversations people have today. So there we're going to talk about conservatives versus liberals and the kind of identities that I think you guys have. But the problem has been, is I've used a word so far without defining it. And it was just one of those things about where to fit in this definition. That word is obviously capitalism. So we need to talk about that, because where would I put capitalism? Capitalism would occupy a whole wide area of the spectrum. It would go all the way from, say, 4, right? Fascism is not capitalist, right? It's not a competitive market. It would go from 4 all the way to 8, all the way into countries that you would say are socialist. It depends how much. So a wide part of this spectrum, right, say from 4 to 8, is capitalist. So let's explain that with our basic model of production and distribution. So how does capitalism work? Here it is in its pure form. If you have a capitalist society, directly, purely capitalist, all production is aimed at profit. How is production organized? For profit. What do you make? Depends on if it's profitable or not. That is the sole goal of production. Who gets hired? Whoever gets hired is hired purely because they maximize profit. That is the goal. That's the reason for being of making anything or doing anything if it's a purely capitalist model. How are things distributed? By definition, things are distributed by a person's ability to pay for them. But that's not how it typically works. We should combine ability to pay with willingness to pay. And in fact, you would say for most goods and services, they're distributed on willingness to pay, not how much anything costs actually. For example, how much is a diamond worth? Well, a diamond is worth as much as any other rock. What are its uses? Not much. I guess it's a kind of pretty little rock. Now, is it good for cutting things? Yes, right? It's good for cutting things, but that's not how people are buying it. How much does a diamond cost to make? As much as it costs to dig it up. But what are people willing to pay for it? A ton, because we trick people into thinking these things are scarce. We make them think they're valuable, and so that makes the value go up, even though its actual value is very little. And thirdly, how is property distributed? Well, property is distributed again for profit and people's ability and willingness to pay for it. How much does property cost? Completely depends on the whims of the market. All right, so that's the bad side of pure capitalism. But let me say something about the good parts of it. Is capitalism a very efficient way to produce things? It can be. It can be as long as there is the competition underlying in society. If there is genuine competition over a product or service, then what happens? Different companies will try to provide that service or that good, and they will compete for your dollars. What does that usually result in? If there is good competition, that'll increase the product's quality and bring down its price. When do we see this working well? I think it works well for clothes. I think it works well with some types of food. I think it works well for cars. Because what do you have? You have companies competing at every price point for the consumer. And so you find good quality goods and services at every price point when there is that competition. Does this work for healthcare? Sorry, going back to the bad side. No, there isn't real free competition in healthcare. When you're sick, you don't check to see which hospital you're going to go to that has the best price for the particular service you're going to need. You don't know what service you're going to need. You can't see how much it's going to cost because you're in an ambulance and you're going to die. So, and also, is there good health care, let's say insurance, at every price point competing for your dollars? No. In this country, poor people can't afford it at all. Working class people can barely afford it. And when they can afford it, they only have a couple choices at the most. So there isn't any incentive for these companies to compete for those dollars. They simply leave them out and then depend on government or some other charitable organization to help people have access to the healthcare. And so now we can go to another sort of blanket term that is going to cover a wide range of our spectrum as well. And in fact, you'll see that this one overlaps with capitalism. What is it? Socialist economic models. Alongside this capitalism as covering a wide spectrum, again, capitalism covers everything from 4 to 8. Now, of course, what does that mean? How much of your economy is run by capitalism would put you farther to the right. If the capitalism is highly regulated or very limited in its coverage, then you're down towards a 5 or a 4. All right. So we need to, at the same time now, put alongside it the other major overlapping economic model, and that is socialism. So we're going to do socialism in just its broad outline. Here are the basic conditions for socialism. Again, production, distribution, property. In socialism, in its pure definitive form, right, production is aimed at meeting the needs of the society. Instead of profits, now you're trying to meet the needs of society and you're trying to meet the needs of everyone. Because it's not about competition, it's supposed to be about fairness and equality. Right? We'll talk. Now, of course, what does that usually mean? Production is organized by the government. And so is there room for corruption here? Yes. Is there room for corruption in capitalism? Yes, it's incentivized. But, of course, can this lead to corruptions in socialism? Yes, of course. So, production is organized to meet the needs of society, and the trick is, how do you find out what those needs are? Who is going to oversee this production to make sure people are getting their actual needs met? Good? Distribution. Here is the straightforward part, right? And this should sound familiar. Distribution is based on the needs of the citizen if they work. Now, if they are unable to work, their needs are provided for. But what is it supposed to mean? In its pure form, it is supposed to mean if you work, you get everything you need. Third, property. How is property distributed in socialism? And here is the big calling card. Socialists usually agree that what's called private property needs to be abolished. Private property is gone. All property is collectively owned by the people. Now, people, again, can get really fuzzy. Does this mean that everyone collectively owns it, like some kind of communitarian situation, the kibbutzim in Israel, right? Or does that mean the government owns all the property, right? So there's a point of contention, a lot of fights about how property is distributed. But let's talk about the basic idea of abolishing private property, okay? Please know that private property does not mean just any property that is owned or possessed by someone. Private property is property that is owned, but others are charged interest for using it. Notice this. It's very different than what most people think. So, to have private property in this special sense means that you own something, you don't use it, and you make an income by charging other people interest on that property. Notice what this means. This means that if you are using your home, right, you are using your car, it's yours, it is not abolished. The idea of abolishing private property is to give the workers and the citizens the property that they use and work on every day. So what would this amount to? To abolish private property would mean you now own your house. Sure, you might owe people for the property who worked on the property. You might owe the laborers. You might owe the resources that went into it. But you don't have to pay anyone interest. It is yours if you occupy it and if you use it. What does this mean? For-profit banks are pretty much gone. Who owns most of the houses in this area right here? Any area in this country, actually. Most people would say people do, right? Now, you would say if you don't rent, then you own your house. No, very few people do. You have a mortgage. Who owns your house? In this area in Albuquerque, it's mostly Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo owns the house. You pay them interest until you've paid all their interest and all the capital for your house. It's actually their house. If socialism is passed tomorrow and private property is abolished, what would that mean? Wells Fargo's gone. They can't charge you interest on their house. They can't own it. It is now yours. Now, might you still owe money to the builders for the property clearing for building the house? Sure, but you don't owe any interest. Now, as a crazy socialist myself, let me say a couple things about what socialists would say about private property. First, if we're following someone like Proudhon, right? Very angry, fun to read, right? Very angry guy. If we're reading a Proudhon, he would say this: if you want equality, then get rid of this idea of property that we have. People should own their property. It shouldn't be owned and traded for profit. Here's what he would say. The way we practice private property in this country can't be defended because there are two ways that it has historically been defended. Why can you possess something? When can you call something yours? Well, in the ancient Roman tradition, which we adopted some of, occupying something makes it yours, meaning actually being on the property and using the property to sustain yourself. Well, what does this mean? If you live somewhere and need it to survive, it's yours, you own it, as long as you're there, as long as you possess it. Now, that is one justification for property. What would happen in our society if we followed that justification? Well, we can ask the key question. How many people own the property they live on? How many people own the places they occupy? Not very many. Banks own just about everything, and a very few people own those banks and control that property. So we do not follow the occupy sense of property at all. Now, there is a more modern conception. Let's see if we follow that one. This is the one from Locke. This is the one that our founding fathers were reading as they're writing our Constitution and founding documents. Locke said this: property is yours if you labor on it. If you do something to that ground, it is yours. If you till the ground and produce crops, if you cut down a tree and make a house out of it, well, those resources, that property is yours because you labored on it. You have identified it. You have put a stamp of labor on it. If you're reading this carefully, notice who talked like this. Marx. Marx said that you are alienated from your property if it doesn't reflect you at all and you don't own it yourself. Weird. Now, let's see what would happen if we followed this rule, this justification for property in our country. What would happen? Well, let's ask the question we asked about property. How many people own and control what they work on? How many people own and control where they work and the products they produce? What do we say? None of them, right? We could even create some incredibly offensive stats, which are actually true. What percentage of people own what they produce? Almost none. Who owns all of these products? The people who don't work at all. We call them owners. And what do owners do? They don't produce anything. So those who produce don't own. Those who own don't produce. This would lead to a radical shift of flipping over of everything in our society if we actually based our property ownership on labor, which is how it's supposed to be. Now, how do we get around this? People say, well, if you work, you get money, and so money is a reflection of your labor. Is that true? No. What is the best way to make money? Have money or working hard? Having money. Money always makes more money than labor does. Thus, we have the socialist pissed. All right, so let's take our next step a little farther to the left and deal with those kinds of societies that combine socialism and capitalism, right? So now we're in that region, say, 4 through 6, where socialism and capitalism overlap. Good? All right. So there is a big debate among nerds right now about how to distinguish, and this is going to just sound absurd, a democratic socialist from a social democrat, right? I am not going to try to give a hard, fast rule, but let me just kind of blur them into each other, but starting with what we would call this social democrat. To be clear about my own biases. I, in theory, promote some kind of communism, some kind of anarcho-syndicalism, something that's like a 1 or a 2 on our little spectrum we're talking about, on our ruler spectrum. But if you were to, and I would never let you, put me in charge of our society tomorrow, I would not agree, I would not accept the job. But if I was in charge, I would go for something in this 5-4 range. I would just take the best things I find from all the countries in the world and put them into practice here, right? How should we handle crime? Oh, I think Norway does a good job, let's imitate them. How should we handle healthcare? Taiwan does a great job there, so does Japan, let's imitate them. What about basic social welfare programs? Ooh, Denmark does well, Finland does well, and I would just go through it. Now, what would I end up with? A social democratic or democratic socialist society. What's the idea here? So we'll start on the kind of 5 end of the spectrum with what you would call a social democratic society. The idea here is that you have something that's like a democratic republic, like what we have. You vote for representatives and hope they give you fairer distributions and easier access to production. Fine. But if you're a social democratic society, you have traditions that make it very different than what the United States is like. I don't know if this is due to people having a different ethics. I like to believe it has to do with having a better democracy, meaning people have more of direct input into their representation. They have elections that people participate in, and campaign financing doesn't sway public opinion so much. But anyway, whatever its causes, the idea is that you can have a democratic republic, but your leaders know that public goods are to be favored over private. This means that you spend money on roads, public transportation, education, healthcare, that these sort of public goods are the reason to be of a society. That if a society isn't improving its citizens, then that society shouldn't have a government at all. That's the idea. The reason to be for government at this part of the spectrum is improving the lives of citizens, not just keeping them safe. Where can we find examples of highly socialized public institutions? Let's see if we can see any. Firefighting, roads. You yourself, if you're a student at CNM, that is a highly socialized public institution. Very. Who hired me? Technically, the state of New Mexico. Who pays for me? The state of New Mexico. You are in a socialist enterprise. Who owns this? The public, right? This is a socialist-owned property that we're standing on right now. This is owned by the taxpayers, but controlled by the state. How does it work? In a case like this, I think it works very well. You get a lot of bang for your buck because people are collectively paying for most of it. Oh, and as we get farther down to the left, let me mention places that are like this, right? So if you want to look into what these societies are like, we can easily find them. We can easily look throughout history and find things on the right. But on the left, people have a little bit harder time seeing where do you find that. For example, when Bernie was really charging up, I was so happy at that time. When he was really charging his way ahead of Biden as a Democratic contender in the coming up elections, people were talking about what is social democracy and what is a democratic socialist. And what did they do? Because we have a very uninformed society, they were saying, look at Venezuela. As if that is the only democratic socialist or social democracy on the planet. No. Let me give you examples. And they're really easy to find because almost every rich democracy like ours, except us, right, is social democratic or democratic socialist. So what would you say? Where do you find, right, social democratic societies? Almost every country in Europe and East Asia, and some of the wealthier societies in South America. What is Europe like? What is most of East Asia like? Social democratic. Democratic socialism, that's the rest of the countries in East Asia and Europe that don't fit the social democratic model. They are democratic socialists. Easy. So they're all over the place. You want to find examples? Japan, South Korea, Belgium, Australia, New Zealand. Oop, notice we got into Oceania too, sorry, right? Spain, Italy, France, England. These are the examples. We are the rare exception to not have this kind of model and be a rich democracy. When we jump to, say, number 3 on our ruler, right, we're 3 inches from the absolute radical left, this is where you would have some pure forms of socialism. Say China, for example, it's always kind of wavering a little bit, right? But any pure form of socialism, I would put about 3 on our ruler. All right, so now we're at the very radical end of the spectrum. We're getting closer to, right, communism and anarchism. At about a number 2, I would put various forms of socialism, right? Now, what's the idea? Remember, the basic socialist calling card is no private property. Property is collectively owned by the people or the state, depending on how powerful the government is. And secondarily, production is to meet the needs of society, and distribution is based on you get what you need as long as you work. Unless you can't work, then your needs are provided for. Children, the elderly, things like this. So at this end of the spectrum, notice what is happening is you're getting rid more and more of the controlling central government. So now the idea is, how is production organized? In a purely socialist model such as China, well, it's organized by the state, by the government. As you get closer to communism, the government becomes more and more limited. So let's say a number 2 would be an example like what's called anarcho-syndicalism. What's the idea here? And again, the issue is, how is production organized? In anarcho-syndicalism, you don't have a government. Instead, the workers organize production themselves. You can think of some forms of unions replacing the need of a government, for example. And so the idea here is, it's worker control of the economy. The workers see what people need, organize production to meet that need, and so they are in charge. You don't have a central government. You just have different, say, unions working together to organize production. Can this work well? Sure, right? Where do you see examples of this? Now, we don't see it on large scales anywhere, but there are areas, say, the kibbutzim in Israel, different areas of Catalonia in Spain. When Argentina had its capitalistic collapse, there were several sectors of the economy in Argentina that were anarcho-syndicalist. There are collectives and worker-owned productions companies in the United States that are on an anarcho-syndicalist model as well. Let's talk about that briefly, okay? Let's talk briefly, just as a little story, about the anarcho-syndicalism that arose in Argentina, for example. Argentina had a complete economic collapse. They went for a U.S. libertarian style model in the economy. It did well for a very short period of time and then tanked, and all the major stockholders fled with their money, fled the country, and just shut down the production. They outsourced all the production and all the industry. Good? So, what happens? Workers are sitting at home and they're miserable. People want to work. I know Americans don't believe that because you think everyone's lazy. Why are you lazy? Because you're alienated. Anyway, long story short. What happened in these factories is that people were really sad and felt worthless because they weren't working their jobs. And so they decided to open the factories themselves. The owners had just abandoned all the factories and most of the equipment. And so what did they do? They just returned to work. And then they found other companies to trade with, and then they would sell directly to the public. Now, this is fascinating because you had these handful of years where the economy was just run by the workers in different parts of Argentina. What's fun is you can look at what happens in these models, right? In most of the models, what they decided on, because the workers were in charge, is they decided that everyone gets the same salary and all decisions are by pure democratic vote. It was fascinating. For example, I remember seeing some footage of a sewing factory where they would make men's suits. right? So this was a men's suit factory. The owners abandoned it, and so the workers just took it over. What did they do? It's so fun, because I remember they were interviewing this one lady, and they said, they were asking, okay, so who's the manager? They said, we don't have one. Well, who handles the books? Who is in charge of the financing? And she said, Mary over there is, right? What? And then they turned to Mary, and Mary says, yeah, I'm pretty good at math, so I handle all the accounting and all the books. And they looked at her and they said, but you're sewing. She's like, oh yeah, I just do all the accounting and the books on Friday for 2 hours before I go home. And how do I do it? I add up the costs of production, and I put money into any materials we need, any machines that need to be fixed, and then all the rest of the money is just distributed equally among the workers. It only takes me 2 hours at most. It's a really easy job. I can't believe we paid someone to do just that all week. Super fun. Then we get to number 0 or number 1 on your little ruler spectrum, the far left. What do we have here? Pure communism, or just literal communism. We shouldn't use that word until we're way down here. And this is what most anarchists are. Yes, there are some anarchists that just want to destroy things, and they make some pretty fascinating angry music. But when you come to actual economic and political anarchism, it is actually almost the same thing as pure communism. Now, what's the idea? Because people use this word completely wrong. Remember what I was saying before when you get farther down the spectrum. In communism, there is no central government at all. Notice that. Repeat. Communism means there's no central government. So when people start to say Russia is communist, or China is communist, or Venezuela is communist, you simply ask, do they have one central government? Yes, they do. Well, by definition, they're not communist. Now, to be fair to those countries, their idea was the Marxist idea that you have to be socialist first before you can be communist, so they could say, we're communist, which only means they hope to one day be communist. Here's the idea. So let's go to our 3 factors. Production, distribution, and property. Property is easy. There is no private property. Property is owned collectively by everyone. But in this case, it is purely up to the decisions of either democratic vote or just individuals working it out for themselves. Now notice, communism at this level only works if people are fair and people genuinely care about each other and want to produce. How is production organized? Production is organized freely by people who get together and decide to produce. Where do they get resources? People collectively make decisions about resources. Weird, right? The even weirder part is distribution. Remember, in socialism, production is to meet the needs of society and distribution is based on work. Well, in pure communism, production is freely organized and distribution is absolutely free. People take whatever they need or want. Notice, there is no need for a government because there is no need to see who is working and who is not. There is no need to organize production. The workers organize production. And imagine this. You make something, what do? You just put it in the marketplace without a price tag and people take whatever they need. Very radical notion. The idea here is a Marxist one. The idea here is that how you become satisfied in society is from your work. Not by the things you consume, but your work is where you meet your needs. And, here comes the propaganda, I like this. When you look at your needs, they are best met through creative, genuine labor. Your needs for acceptance, expression, purpose, and love are best met by creatively working together with others, and what is very satisfying, meeting the needs of other people in your society. There you get your respect and appreciation and acceptance. So let me ask a basic question. Do any of you have hobbies that are creative and productive? Do any of you work on cars? Do any of you cook? Do any of you sew? Do any of you write music? Do any of you produce art? Do you? Do any of you read for fun and write for fun? Yes, you do? Well, you're communist then. Because if you do that stuff for fun, that means you're doing it without pay. You are doing it for free because you find it rewarding. That's the idea of a pure communist model. People produce because they find it satisfying, and they find it satisfying to meet the needs of others. And so if we see a need that's not met, and I think this is true, people will freely organize to meet that need. Cough, cough, the Red Cross. Cough, cough, Doctors Without Borders. Cough, cough, open source software. We see this work, and it's brilliant. Okay, good. So we got all the way down our spectrum, and now let's go back to the middle. Let's go to the place around the number 6 on our ruler, to where most of us spend our daily lives and our daily work. So let's talk about that middle point. Now notice, if I was to talk about political discourse in this country, let's say in the 1980s. In the 1980s, political discourse was tiny. The most radical leftist was someone who wouldn't even count as a social democrat in Europe. That kind of person was not even around. I mean, the people were around, but the public didn't talk about them. The far right, even libertarianism wasn't really a big thing. It was just starting to become popular because of Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman, right? So the discussion got a little up the scale that way. But for the most part, American discourse and American politics is right in this very middle. We do not have radical leftists, radical righties, right? We don't, right? We are hating each other even though we are very close together in terms of ideology. So let's talk about that middle. So let's first talk about the basic name-calling names. Let's talk about liberal and conservative first, okay? So let me try. And again, I'm going to try to define these in ways to where people who hold to them would agree with them, okay? So let's go right to left like we have been doing so far. The conservative. What does a conservative want? What do they care about, right? So let's talk about it in just a value concern first, and then we'll go into the further name calling and the words they use in a bit. The basic idea of the conservative is we should conserve. Notice, that's where the word is, right? We should preserve or conserve traditional values and traditional institutions to make the society more peaceful and to prevent chaos. What is a liberal? A liberal is concerned with expanding the rights and freedoms of everyone, including those who are unpopular. Now notice what this means, right? So this means if you have gay, transgender, black, disabled Muslims, right? We are worried about their rights and freedoms as well, right? Notice how that gets offensive if you're a conservative. No, we need to keep things the way they are. Conservative says, we have a very fragile society. We shouldn't change things too quickly. Liberal says, we should find whatever group we can and try to give them special rights as well, right? So again, now you can understand why your conservative uncle and your hippie liberal aunt can't stand to talk to each other. All right. Now let me give you one more term in this kind of a liberal-conservative divide. It's very much on the liberal side, but, right, that's just by definition, because I think even you conservatives would have this liberal ideology. This will be what Rawls will occupy. So we'll talk about Rawls in a little bit, but let me tell you what his actual position is and what it's called, because I think you will like it. This, and it's somewhere left of center, right, is called an egalitarian. The egalitarian, like Rawls, believes that it is okay if there are some inequalities in society, as long as the inequality was due to innate or developed skill or hard work, or a combination of the three. So notice, if someone has more money than someone else, and this is because they worked harder, they had an innate skill, or they developed a skill, then you would say that's fair. And notice, that should lead to the benefit of society, because what you would have is a meritocracy. The best doctor, yes, could have the most patients and get the most money, and that leads to benefits for society. Now notice, this means that inequalities are unfair. Now, the obvious reasons hold. If you cheat or stole, that's unfair. But it's also unfair if it's strictly due to just luck. If you have more money than I do just because you won the uterus lottery, you happen to be born into a rich family and that's the only reason you're wealthy, you did not work harder, you did not have innate skill, you did not develop skill, then that's an unfair society. Now, what does this mean? If you're an egalitarian, you think one of the government's primary jobs is to protect equal opportunity, so that someone who has innate skill and is willing to work hard and or develop that skill should have every opportunity to attain positions in society that they deserve. What does this usually mean protecting? It usually means protecting education and healthcare, because these are the two things where if everyone has access to quality education and quality healthcare, then their innate skill, their hard work will result in them achieving these opportunities in life. And I think that's where most Americans are. I think most Americans are egalitarian in this sense. They don't necessarily want government to intervene in giving people the same amount of wealth, but they do want our government to protect equal opportunity. How well does our country do? Very poorly, actually. Do you know that we're known as the land of opportunity, but we have very limited socioeconomic mobility? In fact, it is the socialist or democratic socialist and social democratic countries that now have much more economic mobility than we do. We used to have economic mobility when we were a social democracy after World War II with the New Deal. And this went straight through the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. We had incredible economic mobility. Why? Very cheap public education, GI Bill, right? Cheap, affordable housing due to social programs. What did this make us? A very equal society with a huge middle class. So why in this country can people who are very close in terms of their ideologies hate each other so much? So let's talk about that, right? The main reason there is this incredible divide by people who aren't too far apart on the spectrum is because two things: their ideas of human nature and what they think government is for. Ideas of human nature first, and you should be able to see this. Remember when we began our conversation about human nature and I said, your view of human nature is a better predictor of your politics than anything else. Well, here it is. What do you find? People on the left tend to think that people are good if their needs are met. So what do they think a society should do? Meet people's needs, and then we have less need for control and less reason to fear others. What do you believe if you're on the right? If you're on the right, you think human nature is selfish, greedy, and so you need strong controls to prevent people from hurting one another because they will. What does this mean? So now think of how much your conservative uncle and your hippie liberal aunt hate each other. What does your aunt want, right? She wants people to be cared for because people are good. What does your uncle want? He wants people to be put in their place because they can't be trusted. And this leads directly to the second issue, is what is government for? Well, let's go to the conservative. If you're on the right, you think government can only be trusted with protecting us. It's a very cynical view of human nature, so you think society is fragile. All government can do and should do is provide police, prisons, militaries. It shouldn't try to care for us because people are so corruptible they can't be trusted to do the right thing. And the conservative also thinks an economy is so complex that if you try to control it, you're going to screw it up. That's actually a good point, right? That is an issue. What is government for if you're a liberal or on the left? What is government for? Government should use our collective resources to improve our lives. If we would be better off all by ourselves, we shouldn't be in a society. Society should provide things like firefighters, hospitals, and roads that we can't provide for ourselves. So do you see how they get mad at each other? What does a conservative want? Low taxes except for the military. What does a liberal want? High taxes so we can have parks and roads and rainbows and bouncy castles. Sorry. Good. Now let's talk about how they use language very differently so the conversations get nowhere. All right, so first, So what I will do is I'll talk about the 5 different sort of languages, sorry, that's wrong, the 5 different sorts of valued claims, and then talk about how they're heard, whether you're on the left or on the right. So let's start with the one that's shared, and it's more on the left, but this one is a language that's shared. And this is the idea of care versus harm. If you're a liberal, you think this is the best way to tell if something is done well. If something is working well, that means people are being cared for and not harmed. Now notice, if you're on the right, you agree with this, but you don't think that's the government's job. You think citizens should care for one another through charity, and people should care for themselves. So, a little bit more lefty word, care. Second word, fairness. Fairness is a value that is both on the left and the right, but notice now we're starting to see how they have different ideas of what is meant. On the left, right, if you want to see the worst about them, they think fairness means equality. Everyone should have the same things. Now, if you're being a little more fair to the liberal, it means everyone should have the same rights and the same opportunities. That's what they mean by fair. On the right, what does fairness mean? Reciprocity. You should get what you deserve and nothing else. So what do conservatives get pissed at? Every little kid getting a trophy in their little soccer tournament. They don't all get trophies. The world is an unfair place and kids need to learn that. Everyone doesn't win. Do you hear it? They want reciprocity, not equality. All right, next. Value claim number 3, loyalty. On the right, they like this sort of idea. What is the idea? Something like patriotism or group solidarity. They love Italian night and where you get into your ethnic heritage and that's how you identify yourself. Well, notice on the left, they hear this sort of call to loyalty and they think, right? And they hear scary things. They hear what? Patriotism and fascism and jingoism, right? What they hear is in-group and out-group thinking. That if you're not one of us, then you are worth less. Now, does the liberal have a certain point? In-group, out-group thinking can justify a lot of terrible treatment of people. If they are in the out-group, our tribal minds go back to a kind of Neanderthal sort of thinking and think, I can't trust you, you aren't one of us. On the right, we need this kind of group solidarity. I think there are aspects of this that the left have gone too far away from. We need to care more about the collective. Anyway, but if you talk about collectivism, what does conservatives think? You're a socialist, right? So see, this conversation gets nowhere. Fourth value claim language is the idea of authority. Now, conservative, they like this idea. They think there are rational authorities, certain things need to be dealt with in hierarchies, you need leaders. And there is a sense where if someone knows more than you and they're trying to benefit you, that is a good sense of respecting that person's authority. Now, if we want to be perfectly rational, right, if we want to be in between somewhere, we would say rational authority diminishes or diffuses its own authority over time. Notice this. Should children listen to their parents because their parents know more about growing up? Yes. But if you're a good parent, what are you doing the whole time? Trying to diminish your authority over time. Meaning, the more I parent you, the less you need me as a parent until you are ready to be independent and don't need a parent at all. And that is my job, training you to be independent. What is a good teacher? A good teacher is one who wants to teach you everything they know so you can replace them as teacher as authority. Now, what is the worst aspect of this? Of course, what does a lefty hear when they hear the word authority? They hear obedience to authority, and they'll show you the Milgram video again. Terrifying. Fifth and finally, ideas of purity or the sacred, right? Now, on the right, what's this idea? God, the soul is sacred, the family is a sacred institution, things should be protected and kept in their purity. Good? What does the left hear? Well, the left hears some kind of very authoritarian idea about what is pure and what is impure, what is a pure marriage, what is a pure sexual relationship, and these things have been very oppressive over time. Now, at the same time, is there a sense where liberals need to appreciate this sense a little bit more? Sure. Should people in their sexuality have more concern for their own integrity? Yes, they should, right? They shouldn't demean themselves in videos, porn, right? That's treating human beings in ways they should be treated. Now, where do liberals get absolutely stupid in this? Notice, the only time a liberal will talk about the moral value of the sacred or the pure is when they talk about nature and food. And this is when they get just as stupid about purity as conservatives are about marriage, right? What do you see? How much will your hippie liberal aunt pay for pure organic asparagus essence water? Do you get it? What do they do? They pay extra for organic water. There's no such thing, right? That's insane. Do they go way too far in their concern for the pure and the organic when it comes to nature and food? Sure, right? For example, there's something called, it's either golden wheat or golden rice. It's a genetically modified organism, but it's completely open source, not for profit. What does it do? It increases vitamin A in various grains. This would save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who have vitamin A deficiencies because of their very strict and very reduced starvation diet. But what did liberals do? They refused to allow it on the market because it was impure. It was genetically modified. So they put it right together with all the terrible genetically modified substances and got rid of it just because it's impure. Anyway, lunacy. All right, thanks.